everybody. If you weren't here last night, welcome. We'll have 3 sessions today. We'll have this session. I don't have the schedule. Sorry. And we'll have this section. We'll have a break. We'll have a second section. We'll have a nice lunch around 12:30, and then finally we'll come back together at 1:30 for our last session, and then have great Vespers. Other than that, welcome back, Father Jeremy.
All right, so yesterday we had an introduction reflecting on our modern idea of sacrifice and comparing that to the biblical idea of sacrifice. Now we're going to, in this session, get more in depth on how the ancient people of the Bible viewed sacrifice. And the basis is the language of the Old Testament, and specifically 3 main metaphors that are used in the Old Testament to describe sacrifice. Sacrifice as food, aroma, and gift. And what unites these concepts is that they are all signs of invitation, welcome, and fellowship. That these are all practical, everyday ways that people build relationships. Sort of through the sharing of food, through producing an enticing aroma, and through the exchange of gifts. First of all, there's an echo. First of all, sacrifice as food. We see in the Old Testament that almost all forms of sacrifice, or I should say all the forms of sacrifice except for incense, which is a category related to sacrifice, but all of the other forms of sacrifice involve foodstuffs. Meat, so when we think of animal sacrifices, those are actually offerings of meat. Cereals, which are grains, ground into flour or then baked into bread or cakes or crackers. Wine was offered as part of the sacrificial rituals. And then oil. Oil was used in the production of the baked goods. And also any cereal offering that was offered except for a sin offering had to have oil on it. And so the fact that these offerings are all foodstuffs is significant. St. Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century, he drew attention to this fact, that edibility is characteristic of sacrifice. And specifically, in the context of his saying this, he's referring to the instructions for the preparation of sacrifices. Not only are these are these offerings all the raw materials that are used for food, but they have to be prepared as food before being placed on the altar. In every case, there is some kind of culinary preparation that has to precede offering the gift on the altar. In terms of animal sacrifices, the animal has to be killed, it has to be skinned, and cut into portions of meat. This, again, from one point of view, from our modern point of view, it seems to be a very grotesque and violent ritual. But this is missing the point, because it's this exact same procedure that is necessary in order to put meat in the supermarket. You can't have meat in the supermarket without somebody going through all of those steps, killing an animal, taking its skin off, and then cutting it into pieces. Interestingly, in addition to all of that preparation, the meat has to be salted. Salt has to be put onto the meat, which is another step of culinary preparation. It's like marinating steaks before you put them on the grill. Some kind of seasoning has to be added before the meat can be placed on the altar. Even in the whole burnt offering, which was a type of offering where the whole animal was offered, they didn't just sort of kill the animal and chuck it up on the altar to burn. It still had to be skinned. It still had to be cut into pieces, and then all of the pieces, aside from the skin, which was given to the priests, all of the pieces of meat were put on the altar, but it had to be cut into pieces of meat. So this culinary preparation is required in the case of every offering because the offering has to be turned into food. In the case of grains, you don't just sort of take raw wheat kernels and throw them onto the altar. They have to be ground into flour, but not just any kind of flour. It's specifically semolina, which is a sifted type of flour where it's a certain portion of the flour which was highly valued in the ancient world. So the semolina, so the flour after grinding has to be sifted out into semolina, and then that is what can be offered after oil is added to it. Baked goods, obviously, that's culinary preparation. Preparing cakes and loaves and crackers that would then be offered on the altar. They have to be without yeast in order to be offered on the altar, which is is symbolic because yeast represents sort of the force of sin in the world. It's symbolic of the force of sin in the world. Wine, obviously, wine has to be prepared from the crushing of grapes to the adding of the yeast and the allowing it to form into wine. Oil. It's not just olives being thrown onto the altar, but they have to be, crushed, and the oil has to be gathered. So, St. Cyril says that in all of these cases, edibility is shown to be characteristic of sacrifice. Sacrifice, therefore, is, at its core, an offering of food. So this is a depiction of a sacrifice in the book of Judges. It's a modern depiction of a sacrifice in the book of Judges, where an angel came to two Israelites, a husband and wife, in the form of a man. And they greeted him and they welcomed him, and as you do with any guest who comes, they offered him food. But he told them, if you want to bring some food out to me, bring it out as a offering, as a whole burnt offering. And so they went inside, they prepared a meal, just as they would prepare a meal for any guest. But when they brought it out, they put it on a rock, or an altar made of rocks. And then the angel touched it with his staff. It started burning. And then the angel ascended into heaven in the smoke coming from the sacrifice. The reason why I point this out, actually there are two different stories, and I may have conflated them in the retelling, but they're slightly different details. In the book of Judges, there are two angels that come to people, and they're greeted by an offering of food, which resembles hospitality to guests, except that it becomes a sacrifice that is burnt for the Lord. I also wanted to show this depiction, this particular depiction, in order to ask you, what is the strangest thing in this picture? There's no wrong answer. What do you see as the strangest thing in this picture? They're shocked? They're shocked? Okay, well, what do you think would be shocking to them about this, what's happening there? Oh, you guys have been paying attention, so yeah. I would say most people would think the angel ascending in the fire was, but that's the point I'm getting at, is that this whole goat is laying here on the altar. To modern people, this is the strangest thing. To ancient people, this would be the strangest thing. the idea that you would just kill an animal and throw it up on the altar. In fact, whoever drew this didn't read the text of Judges. Because it says plainly that not only was the animal dressed, cut into pieces of meat, but it was cooked before it was brought out. So they offered, in this case, cooked meat was burned as the sacrifice, which, again, this depiction betrays our modern misunderstanding of sacrifice. Now, not only were the individual offerings food, but they were almost always offered in combination, according to specific instructions in the books of the law. So whenever an animal was offered, it had to be accompanied by a specific amount of wine and a specific amount of oil-soaked semolina, or a starch. And the larger the animal, the more wine and semolina had to be offered along with it. And so sacrifices are not just food, they are meals, right? When that food is presented on the altar, it's presented as really the makings of a basic meal. A meat, a starch, and a beverage. W. Robertson Smith, I guess you'd call him an early anthropologist or classicist in the 19th century, he observed this in his book about the religion of the Israelites. He said, when the Hebrew ate flesh, he ate bread with it and drank wine. And when he offered flesh on the table of his God, it was natural that he should add to it the same concomitants or accompaniments which were necessary to make up a comfortable and generous meal. So, sacrifices are not just offerings of food to God, they're offerings of a meal. And this meal is not just an individual meal. In most cases, there are the whole burnt offerings where everything is offered to the Lord, which is a dramatic gesture of hospitality. I was talking to Father Thomas and comparing it to hospitality that I receive from a Lebanese couple whom I stay with when I visit Australia. They're sort of my parents' age, they're my Australian parents. I go to Australia for a couple of years, and I lived there for a while before that. But anyway, I was telling Father Thomas that every morning when I'm staying with them, I come out of my room, and the whole table is filled with plates of food. And the husband and the wife have already eaten. This is all for me. This whole table filled with plates of food. And the wife is still cooking. And I'll eat like 3% of the food. But the point is not having enough food for me. The point is just the gesture of it. Like the impressive gesture of, and how welcome do you feel if you come out of it, you feel like a prince, right? Like you come out of...
it's an idea of great respect for them.
Yes. It's a great honor. And so, likewise, when a whole animal, we shouldn't say a whole animal, we should say all of the meat from an animal is offered in the whole burnt offering, along with an amount of oil-soaked semolina and wine, that this is a huge act of respect and honor and welcome displayed to God. It's sort of like filling up a whole table full of food just for him. So the whole burnt offering here is kind of the exception, because other offerings, all the other offerings, involve sharing the food between the Lord, the priests, and then, in many cases, the worshipers as well. So the Lord would receive the best portion of the animal, which is the suet. Suet in cattle and sheep is the same thing as lard in pigs. It's the richest, densest fat around the organs of the animal. So the suet of the animal was burned on the altar, all of the suet. And actually, Israelites were prohibited from eating any suet, even though it's used in cuisine, in other cultures. The Hebrews were prohibited from eating any suet because the richest portion belonged to God. He received the best portion. And then there were certain parts which were dedicated to the priests. So the brisket, I think of the right front leg, thigh, and there's specific items from the cuts of meat which were given to the priests. And then the rest, in the case of peace offerings, which probably by volume was the greatest number of offerings that would have been offered, were returned to the worshiper in order for them to then host a sacred feast with their friends and family. Probably within the courtyard, the precincts of the temple. In Deuteronomy, there's reference to the connection between sacrifice and feasting. And if you were here last night, you recognize that connection between sacrifice and feasting, which I mentioned yesterday, which was not just the case in ancient Israelite culture, but also all ancient cultures, ancient Greek culture. We heard a quote, or you heard a quote from Plato about that. Here, Moses says, "To the temple you will bring your whole burnt offerings, sacrifices, first fruits, vows, and freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your cattle and sheep. And there you will eat in the presence of the Lord your God, and rejoice in everything your hand undertakes, you and your households, because the Lord your God blessed you." And there are several places in the law, and actually even before the books of the law, in Genesis, the first book of the law, but before the law was given in Moses, where this connection between sacrificing and feasting in the presence of the Lord, these two ideas are connected. Sacrificing and feasting in the presence of the Lord. So sacrifice becomes this shared meal where God is the honored guest. He's the honored guest, but then he actually becomes the host, according to Philo of Alexandria, because this offering is given to him, and then he's the one who, by the instructions of the law, gives it back to the people. So God, he's both the honored guest and he's the host, sharing the food that's been offered to him with his people gathered in worship. This connection between sacrificing and feasting is also reflected in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 18, where St. Paul writes, "Are not those who eat the sacrifices partakers of the altar?" And there in that context, he's comparing ancient Israelite sacrifices with ancient Gentile sacrifices, pagan sacrifices, and with the Christian Eucharist. All three kinds of sacrifice, he says, are governed by this principle. And that's how he goes on then to say that it's impossible for Christians to eat both Christ's sacrifice and the sacrifice of demons, the pagan sacrifices. But because they all operate on this same principle, that the offerers of the sacrifice, they eat of the sacrifice, and this draws them into fellowship with the one to whom that sacrifice was offered. In the case of the Eucharist, draws us into fellowship with Christ. In the case of the Gentile pagan sacrifices, it would draw you into fellowship with the demons. And therefore, you should not partake of them. So sacrifices were symbolic hospitality offered to God and shared among his people. And here, I'll pause. Are there any questions before we go on to sacrifice as aroma?
Well, just on that previous quote from Corinthians,
Yeah.
it's easy for us to understand eat the sacrifice. In particular, partakers of the altar means what exactly?
That word partakers is also, the Greek word is also translated communicants.
Oh, okay.
communicants of the altar. So it's really, it's the same word used for receiving Holy Communion.
Another also that may be done by Hollywood, I'm thinking of the Bible by John Houston. And, who is it, George C. Scott takes up, Isaac and have an altar there. And he puts his son on the altar and he's gonna kill him.
Yeah.
Well, it's pretty good with the way that I read
Yeah.
Genesis. But if we follow this, he's gonna have to cut up his son before he sacrifices it.
Yeah. So
I
this
don't
is
know if I understand.
this is an exceptional offering, the offering of Isaac, because elsewhere God prohibits any kind of human sacrifice. And of course, in the end, he also prohibits Isaac's sacrifice. It ends up being a test of Abraham.
Right.
Where, will he come up to the point of showing that he is willing to do it? And he does, and that's how he demonstrates his faith, and then the angel appears and says, no, stop, because I've seen your faith, and instead, the angel points him to a ram in the thicket for him to offer instead. So that is an exceptional thing. We can't use it to interpret all the other sacrifices. We have to interpret it in light of those other sacrifices. And in this sense, it's similar to in Greek culture, a different culture, but in Greek culture, the way that human sacrifice appears in tragedies, as this strange exception, which is meant to shock and make you rethink. So there's a dramatic purpose in these anomalous sacrifices. If you buy my book, there's a whole half of a chapter on the sacrifice of Isaac.
Sorry, you talked about yeast being
Yeah.
representative of sin, so why is it allowed in the Eucharist?
Yeah. So the prohibition from yeast in sacrifices is probably the basis for Latin, Western, prohibition of yeast in communion bread. Whereas in our Orthodox tradition, we require yeast. But in this context, so we have to be a little bit more nuanced in our understanding. Yeast is the life of bread, right? It's the life of bread. And St. Paul specifically says, when he's talking about interpreting the Feast of Unleavened Bread in terms of Christ, he says, take out the old yeast of sin and guile or something like that. Take out the old yeast. So it represents the old life. The life that we have, the life of sin that we all have apart from Christ. But when Christ comes, he doesn't just leave us at neutral with the old life gone, but nothing else in its place, right? He introduces the new life of the Spirit. So that's why when we have yeasted bread, it's understood as it's now a new life in Christ. We're not partaking of a dead offering, but of a living offering. So that's how it's understood in our Orthodox tradition.
And maybe it's connected to that, because I have like a half-connected thought here that I'm work through, maybe it's touch on it. So, I've also historically understood yeast to be that way about, sin, and I think the scripture kind of reads that way. But Christ also says the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who puts yeast into the loaf and it leavens the entire loaf.
Yes. This is the example that the fathers will draw in when they talk about yeast in our bread. That it's the old yeast is what we need to get rid of, but then the new yeast of the kingdom of God is what we need to bring in to leaven the whole lump.
So if you're gonna answer this question later, feel free to move on, but the role of fire and is the reason why things are burned, if it's a transformative feature of
Yeah. So it's very simple. So fire turns the offering into smoke, which ascends upward
Right.
to the place where symbolically
Right.
is the divine realm, right? It's where God lives. So it's all about symbolically transferring the offering into God's possession. The Greek word that's translated sacrifice actually literally means to turn into smoke.
So it's,
Yeah.
it's changing it from material to.
Seen to the unseen, right?
Yeah, into a sort of, into a form that can ascend into the, symbolically into the immaterial world.
It really does, I mean, it's transferring the mass and the energy.
Isn't the use of salt underneath also to preserve it?
Well, the use of salt is also symbolic, to represent, it's a seasoning, to make it food, but also it represents the permanence of the covenant, and that's how it's explained in Leviticus as well, is that salt is a preservative, and so it represents how the covenant between God and Israel was supposed to be forever.
Then the second one, the burning of the fat of that strong
Yeah.
fat around the stomach,
Yeah.
that gives a great aroma.
Yes, that's a great segue.
Yeah, people do that.
That's a great segue. In Greek, ancient Greek, they had a term for that savory smell, knisa. And they would talk about how it would attract the attention of the gods, but also would attract the attention of worshipers. And so,
The neighbors.
and this is actually a common theme in Greek comedies, Greek plays, where when a sacrifice is offered, often it's an occasion where people smell it from a distance and they come because they know there's going to be a feast. Yeah. So it draws the attention of the gods and it draws the attention of human beings as well. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, it talks about how this knisa, this savory smoke, ascends to the gods and attracts their attention and makes them favorable towards human beings. For us, of course, we don't understand all of these metaphors as being literally true. They're symbolically true. They're gestures. It's not that God actually needs food, in order to live. It's not that a nice smell will actually change his mind. Like, oh, he was going to destroy you, but now that you're burning that fat, I can't bring myself to do it. But actually, and so sometimes people think, well, ancient people were all kind of stupid because they thought that God could be affected by these material, gestures. I don't think that's the case. I think that ancient people, at least most ancient people, understood these metaphors, that they were gestures. So God is beyond us, but all we have to relate to him is the things of this world. We can't relate to him on his level, we can only relate to him on our level. But in his mercy, he sort of accepts that. And it's the symbolism, the gesture is what's meaningful, not the practicalities of the food and the sacrifice.
So, in your prior remark then, the sacrifice should not be viewed as an appeasement to God, right?
Yeah,
Yet, when we do anything that is pleasing to God, that does have an effect on our relationship and how he deals with us. When we sin, judgment comes. When we do good, blessings come.
yeah.
So how is that not appeasement? What's the difference
Yeah.
between those two things?
Yeah, so theologically, we understand that God is not changeable the way that we are. So God's attitude towards us never changes. He's constantly loving us. But his love, the fathers, especially St. Ephraim the Syrian, describe God's love as like the sun, or like fire. These can provide light, which brings us joy, right? They can also burn. It's the same phenomenon, but two different experiences of the same phenomenon. So another example is the sun can soften wax, but it can harden mud. And so the effect of that same phenomenon is different based on the disposition or the makeup of what's interacting with it. So really these gestures, that from a Christian point of view, all of our worship and all of our work to grow in relationship to God is not about changing God, it's about changing us, to make us more receptive and open to that relationship which God is always trying to draw us into. And on the other hand, like those blessings and curses, the punishments and the blessings, the fact is that God is the generator of life, right? Nothing has life or being apart from its participation with God. And so, on the day that you eat of it, God says to Adam and Eve, you will die. When they sinned, they cut themselves off from the source of life. And slowly they began to die. And the more that we sin, the more we're cut off from the source of life. And it's not just about physical death, it's about social death, emotional death, intellectual death, death of us as a total person. And so that's how we experience punishment, not because God is like, sharpening arrows and looking for someone to punish, but because when we distance ourselves from God, we're distancing ourselves from life. But again, when we return to God, we restore that connection and we receive those blessings of life. So I would say that apart from the enlightenment of Christ, a lot of ancient people, all understood sacrifice as appeasement, especially ancient pagans. There's very common and that actually trips us up a little bit in biblical language, the biblical Greek, because there's a word elaskome or exelaskome, which means appeasement or means propitiation in ancient Greek. And it was used to describe that phenomenon of, people thinking that they could change the mind of God and make God more favorable to, or make the gods more favorable to them by what they did. But in the Septuagint, that word exelaskome is used to translate a different word in Hebrew, kaper, which is translated as atonement. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds, but in the book it explains how the Septuagint translators actually adapted the meaning of exelaskome, because instead of having its object as the gods, so you would propitiate the gods, its grammatical object in the Old Testament is always sin. So you don't appease sin, you remove sin, which the meaning of kaper is to remove. So anyway, in the Bible, those distorted Gentile ways of thinking about trying to change the gods were subtly adapted and changed to help people see that it's not the gods that need to be changed, but we have to have sin removed from our lives in order to experience fellowship with God. So. Sacrifice as aroma. And I've described a little bit how aroma functions in sort of the Greek descriptions of sacrifice, but even in the scriptures, in Genesis, this is from the story of Noah. After the ark had come to rest and Noah and his family had emerged, they offered sacrifices to God out of gratitude for being saved. And it says, the Lord God smelled a pleasant aroma, and the Lord God thought, I will not again curse the earth on account of the works of men, although the thought of man is completely devoted to evil from youth. Therefore I will not strike all flesh that lives as I did. So this is one example, but that idea of a pleasant aroma is repeated ad infinitum over and over again in Leviticus. It's used really as a technical term for acceptable sacrifice. So if you offer the sacrifice in the proper way, Leviticus says it will be a pleasant aroma to the Lord.
I have a question about that.
Yes,
That quote makes it seem like if this, then that. It
yes,
makes it seem like because of the aroma, God
Yes.
decided not to curse the earth again.
yes,
So that-
yes. But here's the tweak, and I don't think I gave you this quote. The tweak is at the end of Leviticus, and I mentioned this in the book. At the end of Leviticus, God describes the blessings that come with righteousness and the curses that come with wickedness. And one of the curses is, God says, if you disobey my law and you don't keep my ordinances, I will no longer smell your offerings. So even though it's stated in this term, God smelled a pleasant aroma, is it just the material smell that's affecting God? No, it's the intentionality that goes along with it, the fidelity that goes along with it. So if the fidelity is lacking, then the smell is no longer pleasant. So it's not just about the material smell, it's about the intentions that go along with it. And, those can be described as changing God, but really that's from the human point of view. It changes our relationship with God, is more accurate. Which from a theological point of view is not about changing God, because he's always been loving and always been good. It's about changing us to be able to receive it.
So this actually relates to what we said last night about Cain and Abel, and about their sacrifices. So it's the same thing with the aroma.
Yes, because what we said last night was Cain's sacrifice was not acceptable because he didn't carefully select the best things. So he wasn't putting his heart into sacrifice, in order for it to represent a true and total devotion to the Lord, as Abel's did, because he chose the best.
Sorry, then not to belabor it, like, is this a proper paradigm? Because I was thinking as you were explaining that, like a child-parent situation where, like, when your child comes to you, they're trying to reconcile, let's say.
Yeah.
Like, that reconciliation, like, as a parent or as a God, like, you may need to discipline them or correct them or do these things, but when they, like, enter back into reconciliation, in a sense, there's appeasement, because like, hey, I'm not gonna have to take these actions to kind of correct them, because they're trying to move into that corrective lane themselves.
Yeah, but it's, like any ideal situation where the parent is truly being a good parent, it's not that they like hated their child and then now they love their child. Their feelings didn't change toward the child, but they recognize that, given the circumstances, I may need to do this to help my child, or I may need to do this.
The methodology.
Yeah. So, if the child is genuinely contrite and clearly, working on changing, then you're not going to punish them just to fulfill some obligation that you have to punish them, because, punish lawbreaking. Yeah, good. Okay.
I can't help but draw parallels to our modern practice. I mean, tithing and offering,
Yeah.
giving tithes and offerings,
Yeah.
and offerings. Like, I mean, that's what's in my head as I'm processing what you're saying. It's like, we can give of our finances unworthily as well as worthily in a way that is a pleasant aroma versus an unpleasant aroma.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, there are a lot of connections there, okay, so here's another example of pleasant aroma. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the sons of Israel and say to them, my gifts, my presents, my food offerings, you will continue to bring me as a pleasant aroma on my feast." But that term pleasant aroma is, as I said, repeated ad infinitum in the books of the law. Biblical scholar Jonathan Collins, he describes aroma and its relation to sacrifice in this way. He says, sacrifice attracts and maintains the divine presence. The purpose is to provide regular and constant pleasing odors to the Lord, so that the divine presence will continually remain in the sanctuary. But this again comes with the caveat, as I said from the end of Leviticus, that it all depends on having the right motivations, and for the proper symbolism to to be in the gesture. It's not, again, that God is like some, ditzy, person who, is led along by his nose like, oh, I smelled something good and now my feelings have totally changed towards you. But this idea of aroma, again, it's about building relationships. On one hand, there's that savory smoke that draws people to the feast, remember the commercial of the guy who's grilling the sausages outside and all the neighbors come over. Charlie, somebody's grilling Johnsonville brats or something like that. I remember this commercial from my childhood. But, it's that idea that, that somebody's cooking and it draws people to them. That's part of it. Or think about it in terms of when you have guests over to your house, especially the women. Maybe men don't think about this. I don't think I do. But you're inviting people to your house, and maybe you want your house to smell good, and so you light a candle, or you have a fragrancer, or something like that. Or we do this with our person, right? We wear perfume or cologne in order to attract people's attention, in order to have, or make them feel comfortable around us, to have, to build a relationship with them. So again, even this idea of aroma is about building relationships.
It sells houses.
It sells houses too.
Bake chocolate chip cookies to build a house.
Yes.
And he never brings it here.
Okay. Sacrifice as gifts. Sacrifice as gifts. And this is most clearly seen in the Septuagint, where the technical term for sacrifice is the word gift, literally. In fact, the word sacrifice is used very infrequently in the Septuagint. Instead, they're called gifts. That's the technical term for sacrifice. And even in Hebrew, the word for sacrifice probably refers to a gift brought when approaching, because the Hebrew word means sort of like a means of approach. But that reflects even more clearly the idea of a gift as the initiation of a relationship, or as initiating, strengthening a relationship. Like you come to someone and you offer them a gift as a way of saying, like, let's be friends. Which is the ancient standard idea of what gifts meant. Today, anthropologists call this concept ceremonial giving, or friend-making gifts. We see this in modern times, in our own lives, in a diminished degree. It was much more expected and entrenched in the culture in every kind of relationship in the ancient world, but we see it even today. Like, how does a man initiate a marriage with a woman? He offers her a ring, which is a gift, right? And if she wants to have that relationship, she accepts the ring. If she doesn't want the relationship, then she doesn't accept the ring, right? And we see this also, like in other relationships, we like birthday gift exchanges or Christmas gift exchanges, that gifts are used to build relationships, even on the level of national governments, national leaders. When a head of state visits another country, he'll often bring a gift, which is not really valuable. I mean, like, compared to the $1 trillion budget, of the country. But it's symbolic. It's a symbolic offering. Usually it has some connection to the country, right? The Canadian Prime Minister might come to America and offer a jug of maple syrup or something like that, or a hockey puck or a hockey stick, or I don't know. So Marcel Enoff, a French philosopher and anthropologist, he has a beautiful essay where he describes this concept of friend-making gifts, or ceremonial gifts. He says it is a procedure that consists of committing oneself by giving something of oneself as a token of and substitute for oneself. He also says that this ceremonial gift is a thing that comes from oneself, stands for oneself, and bears witness to the commitment that was made. Think about that engagement ring. You know, sort of like, if we want to idealize, like the giving of the engagement ring, we think about some young man who, doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together, but he loves this woman, and so he works hard, and he economizes so he can save up this money to get her a ring that really shows his love and honor for her. So he's invested himself in purchasing this ring. And then he offers it to her, and if she accepts it, she wears it constantly as a sign or a reminder of the commitment that was made. So that, I think, is a really good example for us understanding the idea of ceremonial giving. But in the ancient world, it was much more common and frequent in all forms of relationship. Really, ancient people couldn't conceive of relationships that weren't built on gift exchange. It was just a standard and accepted form of building relationships on all levels. But it's different from a bride, right? It's not that I'm coming and I'm trying to buy your friendship. Because the gift's importance, its significance, is not in its material value, but in its symbolic value. It has to represent oneself as a thing that comes from oneself and represents oneself, so that, according to this last quote from Hanaff, what is given through the thing given is always oneself. So it's a symbolic gesture at its core, that when you give this gift, it represents giving yourself to the other person. And then when they accept it, they are accepting you. So now coming back to sacrifice, and biblical sacrifice in particular. There were 5 different species of animals that could be offered in sacrifice. Cattle, sheep, goats, turtle doves, and pigeons. And you might ask why. This wasn't just something that Israelites drew from the world around them, from the cultures around them, because if we look at other cultures, they were offering all kinds of weird things, especially the Greeks. I mean, they would offer snakes and dogs and all these kind of things. But the law is very specific, and God is very specific when he gives this law for Moses. These are the only 5 kinds of animals that you can offer. Why? Because they symbolize the kind of relationship that God wants us, human beings, to have with him. The kind of animal and the life of that animal, the physical life of that animal, represents the spiritual kind of life that God wants us to live toward him. So what about these animals? And by the way, this all comes from Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher in the 1st century. Around the time of Christ, but we don't know if he was even aware of Christ, because he was in Alexandria, Egypt. So these animals are all domesticated. They are all therefore tame or obedient to mankind. So they represent the quality of obedience. Also, all 5 of these species are herbivores. They're not carnivores. They don't eat other animals. And therefore, they represent harmlessness. They are also, all 5 kinds of animals are beneficial to human needs. They provide for human needs in a number of ways. So not only by their meat providing food, but they provide milk. They provide for food. They also provide their hides or their wool in order to make clothing or to make shelter, and so they provide for the needs of mankind. And then finally, even with regard to all these species, if you're going to make an offering, you can't just offer any cow, you can't just offer any sheep. What you offer has to be unblemished, meaning without any kind of physical defect or abnormality. And therefore they represent, on the spiritual level, blamelessness or spiritual lack of defect or wholeness. So what do these sacrifices represent? They represent being obedient to God, or we could say loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And they represent not just refraining from harming our fellow man, but also caring for the needs of our fellow man, i.e., loving your neighbor as yourself. And finally, doing this in a perfect way, without any sort of spiritual defect intruding on that life. Remember, I just quoted from Christ's summary of the whole law, right? He said the whole law is summed up in these two commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So when a ancient Israelite made an animal sacrifice, he was committing himself symbolically to following the law. Giving a gift which represented himself, which had these symbolic qualities of faithfulness towards God and man within the context of the law. Yes.
But goats seem to, right?
Yeah.
It's clear
I
to
was
say
saying
as they're like, that's what they define them as, is like they walk along the precipice, they're dangerous, they're like the sheep and the goats. Or the
Yeah. So goats are a little bit anomalous. They are still now and were used as, domesticated animals, and actually I have that quote from Philo of Alexandria, which I can read in a second, but goats are not the most common kind of sacrifice. They're mostly seen as sin offerings. So therefore they kind of bridge symbolically that gap, where yes, they can have those qualities that we just mentioned. They're not especially tame, though. but I mean, I guess a skilled goat herd can keep them under control. And okay, so they're harmless in the sense that they don't eat other animals. But if you've ever gone to a petting zoo, and you try to feed the sheep, the goats are constantly coming up and like pushing the sheep out of the way. And they are fruitful. Okay, so they do provide milk. It's not the best milk, and cheese, everybody cheeses up there. It's an acquired taste. So, but I think that, like I said, goats sort of bridge that gap because it represents I was a sinner, but I'm going to keep trying.
It's kind of a back.
That kind of thing. No, that kind of thing. It's like it's aspirational. It's aspirational. Okay, so here's a quote from Philo of Alexandria. He says, "The pigeon is the most gentle of domesticated and gregarious birds, and the dove is the most tame of those that are solitary. Cattle, sheep, and goats are gentle and manageable in the highest degree." And here I think he's exaggerating a little bit. He says, "At any rate, great herds of cattle and flocks of sheep and goats are driven by anyone at all. Not only by a man, but even by a very small child." I don't see a very small child driving herds of cattle, but he's making a point. "They are all herbivores, and not one of them is carnivorous. Moreover, they are the most useful of animals for human needs. Rams for clothing, oxen for tilling the earth," but I didn't remember that their labor is also useful. "Preparing it for sowing and threshing the resultant produce, for use and enjoyment as food, and the hair and hides of goats, woven and sewn together." Goat hair shirts, I don't know about that. "Made portable dwellings for travelers and especially soldiers." So they used goat skins for tents, and actually that's in the Bible, because the tabernacle was made of goat skins, goat hides.
The animals, are they all male or female or just?
Male and female are both used, but the male is preferred. So the male is in the sacrificial system, the male is a higher gift. It's a more, it's a better gift.
And a note about goats. Goats, that's a very clean animal. Doesn't eat everything like the lamb. The lamb will eat like some paper, whatever leftovers. Goat only eats the tip, the branch,
Yeah.
and eats only everything that's like a flavor, like they like pine, they like grapes, leaves. So their meat smells much better than lamb. And the hair of the goat is the only thing used in ancient time. They weave it and they filter the oil and they press the they can't use like any other material except goat.
Interesting.
You said the animals are beneficial to humans and pointed out the cattle and the sheep and the goats. Do the birds just not have to be beneficial?
They would eat those birds. So those were birds used for food, and they were domesticated. So notice that animals that were hunted, even though they ate hunted animals like deer, etc., wild animals that were hunted, could not be offered as sacrifice. They had to be domesticated.
What does the turtle dove? I understand all the rest, but the turtle dove, what's that for? Because, is it because they love each other, once they mate, they're forever?
Oh yeah, so I focus on the other ones. The turtle dove and the pigeon, those species, they're called by those words in English, but of course they're particular species that existed in the Holy. But and sometimes the pigeon's also called a dove. So the translations are a little bit. I mean, it's translating a word that was used by ancient people for a specific species of bird, which doesn't necessarily match how we use those words today. But they were used for food, like I said. So in that sense, and they were domesticated, meaning that people cared for them, farmers cared for them. But another element, as Philo says, is that pigeons are gregarious birds, meaning like they gather in groups, and doves are solitary, but they're both gentle. They're both tame. They're not like sort of like eagles or hawks or something like that. So they're not carnivorous. They're herbivores and they're gentle. St. Cyril of Alexandria, he points out that the turtle dove sings very sweetly and beautifully. And he makes that connection of proclaiming the praises of God. That represents proclaiming the praises of God. Yeah. There's a lot of different levels of symbolism that come with it. Philo of Alexandria talks about how the animal has to be unblemished and what that means in terms of the giver and his intention. He says, all the animals must be perfect, injured in no part of the body, absolutely without wound and free of blemishes. For through symbols, the law intends to instruct the offerers whenever they approach the altars, whether performing vows or giving thanks, not to bring with them any infirmity, disease, or passion of the soul, but to try to sanctify a completely spotless soul, so that God might not turn away when he sees. And just a little, note there that I put in brackets, sacrifice. The word sanctify can be used as a synonym for the word sacrifice. We think of those as very different things. Sanctify means to make something holy. But actually, in its root meaning, sacrifice means to make something holy. Sacred. Think about the word sacred in Latin, means holy. And the "fice" part of it, ficare, means to make. So sacrificare, or sacrifice, means to make holy. And so you'll find in at least one verse that I found in the Old Testament, the word sanctify is used as a synonym for sacrifice, and in other places in the Fathers and in Philo, I think it's here being used as a synonym for sacrifice. But this idea of when you sacrifice an animal, it represents sanctifying your soul. The word sanctify, making something holy, in the ancient world, really signified putting that thing into the possession of God. The concept of holiness refers to a quality of being associated with the divine. In Greek, aios means holy, but it literally means unearthly, otherworldly. And in the Old Testament, everything associated with God is described as holy. So the temple is holy because it's God's home. The priests are holy because they're God's servants. Sacrifices become holy, the offerings of sacrifices become holy because they're put into God's possession. Right? So these are gifts which, when the offerer is raising them on his farm, they're not holy yet, right? But when he brings them to the temple and he puts them into God's possession, they become holy because they are part of God's world. And likewise, I mean, even from a Christian spiritual point of view, we become holy not because we're following some objective standard of morality. We become holy by yielding ourselves to God, by becoming going into God's possession. God apostrophe S. Which also actually can make us God's small g, without an apostrophe. God's by grace. Okay. So sacrifices were symbolic pledges to show these same qualities of obedience, harmlessness, fruitfulness or beneficence, and lack of blemish in our relationship to God. All right. Any more questions? I think we're over the time limit we started with. We have some time for some questions and then a break. Unless you're all questioned out. Okay, we'll take a break, and if you have questions before we start the next lecture.
And let's try and reconvene. We've got about 12 minutes based on my watch, so let's try and reconvene right at 11:30.
Oh, really? Yeah.